So thank you, Tim, for coming on the show and want to talk to you about your fantastic book, Misfire Inside the Downfall of the NRA. Just finished reading it and it is fantastic. And one of the things that really loved about it and I want you to talk about is beyond the information that you put forward, your storytelling is just phenomenal and how the personalities of these people come to shape this hugely influential organization. So I want you to talk where your book begins with about Wayne Lapierre and how this man who was quote about whom it was quoted had the backbone of a chocolate eclair, one of the many gripping quotes from that first chapter, came to run an organization of its power and of its partisanship.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on, Adam. It's just a real pleasure to be here chatting with you. Um, yeah, the thing that I was so interested in with regards to doing a book on the NRA was that the NRA is kind of a black box, right? We understand what it puts out there into the world, but before this book, you don't really get a sense of the people and the personalities and the characters. And I pulled that curtain back and I looked behind the curtain and it's just chaos. It's just there's so many human elements in this book that show the betrayal and the factionalism and the greed that happens behind the scene in the NRA. And that was what I was really surprised to find and tried to lay out as best I can for the reader in this book. So the book starts with Wayne LaPierre's wedding in the late 90s. And he doesn't want to get married. Certainly not that day. And he spent the whole week before telling his friends and asking his friends, should I do it? Should I go through with it? What should I do? And he decides on the wedding day he doesn't really want to do it. And so the ceremony is super delayed. He's outside, and his best man slaps a $100 bill on the dashboard of the car and says, I don't think you should get married today either. We can get out of here if you want. Um, and Wayne Lapierre was the head of this incredibly powerful organization, already incredibly powerful organization at this time. This is in the late 90s. Kind of gets harangued into going through with the ceremony by the bride and the priest. And what follows is this, first of all, incredibly delayed ceremony. Everyone's waiting around trying to figure out what's going on. But also a deeply awkward one too, in which the groom can't make eye contact with the bride during the ceremony, is looking up, down, to the left and the right, staring at the floor, as all these NRA luminaries are watching this unfold. And it's just this incredibly weird event. And, there's a reason why I tell this story. And the reason is that so many people in powerful positions around the NRA, whether it's Susan Lapierre, his bride that he married that day, and his wife to the present day, or other contractors or senior executives at the NRA, what they've all realized over time is that if you bully Wayne Lapierre, you yell at him loudly enough, he's eventually going to green light, millions of dollars in sweetheart deals for people who have inside connections with the NRA, or golden parachutes for people who are senior executives who are leaving the organization and want to get paid for doing virtually nothing at all.
And that was it's such a compelling way that you open it with that episode with the wedding, and it is indeed as dark as you describe, and I encourage readers to read that. Beyond that, you also describe him, and you portray him right now as being incredibly conflict averse, and that's something. Can you talk about the surprising nature of a organization that's built around conflict, led by this guy who will do anything to avoid conflict, and how
There's
that led the NRA to where it is today?
there are so many ironies around Wayne LaPierre, who's been the head of this organization since the early 90s. One of them, obviously, is that he's this deeply anxiety-ridden individual who, despite being, as you say, the head of this extremely powerful and controversial organization, is just totally fearful of personal controversy or conflict at all, and takes great pains to try to avoid it at every step of the way. You know, that's one irony in his personality. But it also explains a lot of the legal and financial troubles that the NRA is in today. And we can get into that a little bit later. But the real ironies here are this powerful person in charge of a very controversial organization just can't handle controversy. There's an anecdote in the in the book about how one time a bunch of senior officials are getting together in order to strategize after a mass shooting, and they find Wayne Lapierre hiding behind a curtain because he's just so overwhelmed by both self-pity and fear that he can't really get himself together. And the only way he could find to comfort himself was to hide behind a curtain. Another irony, of course, is that Wayne Lapierre doesn't like to shoot firearms. He's not a gun guy, and in fact, is not only bad at shooting firearms, he can be downright dangerous with it. There's this one anecdote of him at a video shoot, and someone calls out to him, he swivels around and points the gun at the person. That's obviously not something that an experienced person with firearms would do. And they're even this kind of gave rise to a joke inside NRA headquarters that those people who didn't do well that quarter or not doing well at work might have to go quote unquote shooting with Wayne. That's another one of the ironies in Wayne Lapierre's personality.
So if you can talk to me about the journey of this book, where it began, and also how you broke the Maria Butina story.
So Maria Butina was kind of one of the reasons why I started writing about the National Rifle Association. I sit down for coffee with a source, gosh, now almost 5 years ago. And the source is talking about this very peculiar person who's running around Washington, D.C., who's kind of describing herself to other people in different ways, depending on the audience. So some people, she says that she works for the Russian government. For other people, she says she's a student at American University. To others, she says she's a translator. To others, she says she's a Second Amendment gun rights activist from Russia, of all places. And it's very bizarre. And the source says, you should take a look at this. And I do, and I start making calls, and I call around, and I call one of her professors, and her professor says, yeah, I've heard her in class talking about how she's a link between the Russian government and all sorts of activities in DC. And other people say that she's bragged about being a connection between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. And also she's hanging around with all these National Rifle Association folks, really networking with and seems very close with the NRA. What's going on there? And then I discovered that she had led a delegation of senior NRA officials to Moscow in 2015. And so I started writing these stories about Maria Butina, and you know the rest, right? She gets arrested and charged with conspiracy to be an unregistered agent of the government of Russia. She's ultimately convicted. She spends time in prison, and she's deported. But this was my kind of entryway into writing about the National Rifle Association. It wasn't something that I had done previous to this. This was back in 2016, 2017 timeframe. But I started writing about it and thinking about it. And the deeper I looked, the more issues there were presented about the NRA. And 120 plus interviews later, and thousands of pages of secret court depositions and internal emails and private NRA documents later, I somehow have a book on it.
And in the book, you talk about the pre and post Sandy Hook. That Sandy Hook was a big turning point from the NRA, where before was a little bit more bipartisan, that it had connections in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. Then something changes after Sandy Hook. Can you tell us how that came to pass?
Well, there's always been this tension between different factions in the NRA. There are many different factions that I kind of outline in the book, but the two very prominent ones as it relates to this are the lobbyists and the kind of PR, fundraising people, the people who are in charge of membership. And the big tension is the lobbyists are trying to make legislative compromises on Capitol Hill. And the membership people are really, and the fundraising people are always really very much incentivized to uh, to to try to sell fear, basically, to try to convince their members, hey, you got to be worried about the Obama administration taking away your guns or restricting your gun rights in some way. And that's a really big source of tension within the organization, and that really comes to a head after Sandy Hook. One of the several of the chapters in Misfire relate to what was happening behind the scenes at the NRA as Sandy Hook unfolded and in the aftermath. And as you might remember, Wayne Lapierre has this press conference after Sandy Hook and proposes that the appropriate policy response to this tragedy is for more guns to be in schools, for armed guards to be in schools. This was something that was a huge surprise to the lobbyists at the NRA. Chris Cox, who was the head of the NRA at the time, was watching this unfold on television, had no idea that this was the message that the NRA was going to go with, and just lets out an expletive and charges out of the room where he's watching this unfold on television. But Sandy Hook, mentioned to me, and the failure of that legislation really marks a turning point, because after Sandy Hook, the NRA kind of abandons what for a long time had been its most important strategic alliance. Moderate Democrats have been an incredible asset to the NRA, that they can create bipartisan legislation and have supporters, whether the House and Senate are controlled by Republicans or Democrats. But after Sandy Hook, the NRA decides just to double down on conservatives and Republicans. Basically, the idea is that the NRA has become a kind of culture war organization. They're no longer just focused on firearms and firearms policy. They have wanted, since Sandy Hook, to portray themselves as protection between the government and their members' rights of all kinds.
And it's also the genesis, you point out in the book, of Wayne Lapierre's famous quote, the only thing that will stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. As we're talking right now, we have closing arguments in the Kyle Rittenhouse case. There's the trial and the death of Ahmaud Arbery happening at the same time. Without commenting on these cases in particular, do you think that how influential was that remark in shaping the future of the NRA and the kind of movement that it took, that culture war, as you put it, that took off from that messaging?
Well, it's absolutely indisputable that the NRA has had an incredible effect on the way that firearms ownership and whether people carry concealed or open or otherwise, how in the culture of firearms ownership in the United States. Since the 70s, the NRA has been a very activist organization focused on political advocacy, and often their message is what you just described, which is that people need to take it upon themselves to carry firearms or to intervene, and it's impossible to divorce that from the broader gun culture in America today.
And you talked about, you obtained 2.5, you got 2.5 hours of really explosive recordings from what happened after Columbine. This was before Sandy Hook ever happened. The tapes show some of what the NRA officials are saying behind closed doors of their membership. Can you talk about some of the highlights of that?
Sure. So the day after Columbine, senior NRA officials and lobbyists and executives, they're all scrambling on this conference call. Here's the context. The NRA had previously scheduled its annual meeting, and just by chance, it had been scheduled in Denver, not far from Littleton, Colorado, where this tragedy occurs. And it's in just about a week and a half, 9 or so days after Columbine. So it's an incredible crisis that the NRA needs to deal with. I mean, if you look around Denver at that time, there are all sorts of billboards up advertising guns and the NRA Expo that's going to be happening there. And they need to figure out what to do about this situation. Do they cancel? Do they take other steps? I mean, there were plenty of festivities planned. A comedian was planned, banquets, dinners, all sorts of events, which the NRA is now like, should we have this in the wake of this shooting? And so it's a crisis strategy meeting. And over the 2.5 hours, you hear the wheels in motion for the NRA. The NRA considers a kind of softer approach. They think, well, we could cancel the convention entirely, or we could maybe set up a $1 million victims fund. But as the time goes on and they're thinking about this, they come to the conclusion that they can't really give anything, or they'll be blamed for Columbine, that it's a kind of PR approach, that conceding anything would be an admission of responsibility or complicity in the shooting. And they kind of land on what is to be their strategy for the next 20 plus years, which is that there can be no sort of conciliatory approach after mass shootings. They land on this idea that it's society, not firearms, that's responsible for shooting, that they need to push back hard against the press. And what they do is they come to the conclusion that, that it's basically the no compromise strategy that they use after Virginia Tech, after Parkland, after Sandy Hook. And so you hear these echoes of the strategy for many, many years to come.
And they're also heard denigrating their members, right? What did they say about their membership? The people who are paying the dues we'll get to how they're using the membership dues later. But what are they saying about them behind closed doors?
What's remarkable about some of these tapes is that you hear them privately disparage their members. And basically, the context of the conversation is that they're thinking about closing down that exhibit hall, the expo of guns and accessories that are plastered all across billboards in Denver, talking about their show. They're thinking about paring back their convention due to the shootings at Columbine, but they're also worried about who will show up to the convention after a tragedy like this. And they're basically NRA officials are worried that quote unquote normal NRA members won't show up, and only their most radical members will show up in the wake of a tragedy like this. And you hear NRA officials denigrate the people who might show up as hillbillies and idiots and nuts and fruitcakes. You hear Wayne Lapierre, the CEO of the organization, Marion Hammer, former president and longtime lobbyist, advisors, advertising people. And what you hear is this kind of snickering in the background, this kind of knowing snickering. But what's so shocking about this, of course, is that these are the people who are most dedicated to the NRA's mission, and the NRA has never had an issue with fundraising from these folks or mobilizing these folks when politically necessary. It's just that behind the scenes, they don't respect these people.
Right. And if you're an NRA member, a long time, you keep opening your checkbook because you feel like the Second Amendment is under attack. You hear these guys denigrating you behind closed doors, and where does this set the stage for all of the other revelations? I mean, you found these explosive tapes. There have been other explosive revelations recently about how much money Wayne Lapierre was spending on Xenia suits, about the yachts, the private jets. Has there been a reaction from the NRA membership with all of these explosive revelations coming in rapid order?
There are definitely a lot of NRA members angry about the current situation inside the organization. There's no doubt about it. That there is even an organization called Save the Second, which is made up of NRA members demanding transparency and accountability. There are members of its own board, the NRA's own board, that are protesting the NRA's current spending. And what are we talking about when we're talking about this problem? We're talking about millions and millions of dollars for private jets for Wayne Lapierre and his wife. We're talking about exotic vacations to hang out on yachts into the Bahamas and trips to Lake Como in Italy. We're talking about lavish meals and six figures, like you say, six figures in suits on at the Italian menswear place Xenia on Rodeo Drive. And it goes on and on and on. The New York Attorney General has investigated the NRA, and after an 18-month investigation, accused them of tens of millions of dollars of misspending and misconduct. And they've taken it so seriously that they're asking a court to decide to dissolve the NRA entirely. The NRA, of course, was founded in New York, and so the New York Attorney General has jurisdiction over the NRA through its Charities Bureau. And so this is a real serious existential threat to the NRA's existence.
And I don't want to reveal all of, and I couldn't if I tried, reveal all of the just incredible nuggets of information that you have unearthed in this book. But you paint a very almost Shakespearean portrait of a power struggle between lawyers and a PR firm that corresponds to a fear that Wayne Lapierre has. And at that one of his lawyers, as you write it, takes advantage of his fear of imprisonment because of all of this stuff that is coming out in the public domain, that Wayne Lapierre, according to a lot of people who know him, is afraid of being prosecuted. How credible is that fear with everything that has come forward?
Well, there are a couple kind of bullet points on that, right? Firstly, the Wall Street Journal has reported that the IRS is investigating Wayne Lapierre for potential tax fraud. That's one thing. And secondly, that in testimony during the NRA's bankruptcy proceedings, one of his longtime friends and associates testifies that Wayne Lapierre has openly said that he's worried about going to jail for what he's done. And I think that, Wayne Lapierre probably, everything that I've learned about him as a man who's driven by fear and totally just riveted by anxiety, it wouldn't shock me at all that he's deeply afraid of going to jail for what there's plenty of evidence already in the public domain that he's done.
And the hits just keep on coming for the NRA. There's, as you mentioned, the New York Attorney General's case is still open. It could end with their being ordered shuttered by a court of law. You end your book noting that obituaries have been written about this powerful organization called the NRA many times before. Do you think that this time may be different, that the prior obituaries written in the previous decades, there's something new here? There's a new legal threat. There is new information out, or might they surprise onlookers again?
The NRA has in the past dealt with revolts from its members. It's dealt with legal problems. It's dealt with allegations of financial malfeasance, and it's dealt with just incredible challenges from within and disparate factions infighting. but it's never dealt with all of these things happening all at once and in this acute crisis. The NRA could dissolve, it could be dissolved. I don't know if I'd predict that it will happen, but it's a serious potential outcome, one that the New York Attorney General is asking for, demanding a court to do. So it would be foolish not to take it seriously as a potential outcome. That said, I am aware that many people have predicted the NRA's collapse and end. And Wayne Lapierre is still the head of the NRA. The NRA still exists despite those many predictions. And so I wanted to sound a little note of caution about how resilient it seems the NRA and Wayne Lapierre have been over time.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I can't recommend enough for listeners, as I've mentioned a number of times during our conversation just now. It's a rare combination of a nonfiction book that marries this rigorous investigative reporting with a really deep storytelling and human narration of these personalities that have, without any doubt, shaped our country, our culture, and has led this powerful organization to the pass where it is today. So if you want to learn about how that happened, I recommend this book, Tim Mak's Misfire, Inside the Downfall of the NRA. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.